Right now, you're about to learn about the top 10 Victorian fashion disasters that will shock you. We imagine the Victorian era as a time of elegant ladies in lavish dresses, technological progress, and strict etiquette. We admire the sophistication of the outfits, intricate hairstyles, and refined manners captured in old photographs. But behind this facade of propriety lay a different, much darker reality. Fashion at that time was not just a means of self-expression, but a real social battlefield, especially for women. Every element of clothing, from hats to the tips of shoes, was dictated by strict rules and carried a hidden meaning. The female body was turned into an object that had to be tightened, reshaped, and decorated in accordance with a capricious ideal. Behind the glamour and beauty lay invisible shackles, and the pursuit of fashion often became a deadly dangerous pursuit. Beauty demanded not just sacrifice, it demanded complete submission. Watch the video to the end to find out how the simple desire to be beautiful could lead to unimaginable consequences, and why a fashionable dress was more dangerous than a wild beast. What if I told you that the most fashionable color of the era was a real silent killer? Victorian ladies loved the bright, rich emerald green shade that was called Paris green. This color was everywhere, on dresses, wallpaper, artificial flowers, and even children's toys. The secret to its incredible brightness was a pigment based on copper astarosanite, or, to put it simply, arsenic. The dye was cheap to produce and gave a lasting, beautiful color, which made it incredibly popular. Fashionistas, unaware of the hidden danger, bought green dresses to shine at balls. Every time a woman wore such a dress, she came into direct contact with poison. Arsenic penetrated the body through the skin, causing nausea, headaches, and skin ulcers. But the symptoms were non-specific and rarely associated with fashionable clothing. However, the real victims of this color were not aristocrats, but young factory workers. The girls who made artificial flowers to decorate hats and dresses inhaled poisonous green dust all day long. They worked in terrible conditions, receiving pennies for their labor and paying for it with their health. Doctors at the time sounded the alarm, publishing articles in newspapers about an arsenic epidemic among flower girls. However, factory owners ignored the warnings because the color green was hugely profitable. Society chose to ignore the problem, blinded by the beauty of the deadly shade. A fashionable dress became a symbol not only of status, but also of social inequality. While one woman shone in it at a ball, another slowly faded away in the factory, creating this beauty. It was the price of fashion paid by the most vulnerable. Upon learning the truth, ladies of high society began to reject the poisonous color, but not out of compassion for the workers. They were frightened by the thought that the poison could affect them as well. Thus, the fashion for green gradually faded away, leaving behind a trail of ruined lives. This story is not just about a toxic dye, but about toxic social norms. It shows how the pursuit of external glamour can devalue human life. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how modern, fast fashion echoes this story? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most famous item of Victorian clothing? The corset was not just an item of underwear, but a true symbol of the era and the main tool for shaping the ideal female figure. Its purpose was to create a slim, waspish waist, high breasts, and an elegant hourglass silhouette. Girls were put into corsets from an early age so that their bodies would be shaped correctly from the start. This was considered an integral part of a lady's upbringing, as essential as music or French lessons. Refusal to wear a corset was seen as rebellion against social norms. The design of the corset was far from comfortable. It consisted of thick fabric into which numerous whalebone or steel plates were inserted. At the back, there was lacing that allowed it to be tightened with incredible force, literally reshaping the body. The pressure that the corset exerted on the internal organs was enormous. It displaced the stomach, liver, and intestines, disrupting their normal functioning. This led to chronic digestive problems and other ailments. Breathing in a tightly laced corset was shallow and difficult. Women could not take a deep breath, which led to a lack of oxygen. This is why Victorian ladies fainted so often. They simply did not have enough air. In addition, the corset weakened the back and abdominal muscles. The body became accustomed to constant external support and lost the ability to support itself. After many years of wearing a corset, it was almost impossible to remove it without serious discomfort. Doctors of the time were well aware of the dangers of corsets and wrote numerous articles condemning this fashion. They linked corset wearing to a variety of female ailments. However, their voices were drowned out by public opinion, which demanded that women make sacrifices in the name of beauty. The corset turned women into fragile, dependent creatures, incapable of active action. It was the perfect tool for maintaining the patriarchal order, because a woman who can barely breathe is incapable of rebellion. Do you think there are analogs to the corset in modern culture? Invisible standards that similarly restrict women. In the next chapter, we will talk about a design that was even more cumbersome and ridiculous. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian fashion. If the corset was an internal prison for the body, then the crinoline became an external prison. This huge structure made of steel hoops, designed to support the fullness of the skirt, turned a woman into a walking tent, depriving her of her freedom of movement. Initially, the crinoline was intended to make life easier for fashionistas by replacing numerous heavy petticoats. However, in the pursuit of an ever wider silhouette, it grew to absurd proportions. The diameter of the hem could reach 2 meters, which created a lot of everyday problems. Passing through a standard doorway in a crinoline was a real challenge, requiring skill and acrobatic abilities. Women had to squeeze sideways, squeezing the hoops and risking getting stuck. Sitting on a chair or in a carriage was out of the question. It was a whole ceremony. The crinoline was completely impractical and made women helpless. They could not bend down to pick something up from the floor without risking exposing their pantaloons to those around them. Any sudden movement or gust of wind could lead to embarrassment. This fashion became the subject of numerous jokes and caricatures in the press. Artists depicted ladies getting stuck in doorways, knocking over furniture, and creating traffic jams on sidewalks. Society laughed at the absurdity of the crinoline, but continued to require women to wear it. The crinoline also posed a serious danger. Its lightweight construction could get caught in the wheels of a carriage or caught in a machine at a factory. Newspapers of the time were full of reports of accidents involving these giant skirts. Wearing a crinoline was another way to emphasize social status. A huge skirt unambiguously declared that its owner was not burdened with any work. It was a fashion for idle women whose only task was to be a beautiful decoration in the living room. The fashion for giant crinolines eventually passed, giving way to more compact bustles. But the very idea that a woman's body needed to be artificially enlarged and deformed remained. The crinoline became a monument to one of the most impractical and bizarre fashion eras in history. What I am about to show you was deadly dangerous. The Victorian era was a time of open fire. Houses were lit by gas lamps, candles, and fireplaces, which created a constant risk of fire. And in these conditions, women wore dresses made of extremely flammable fabrics. Light, airy materials such as muslin, tulle, and voile were particularly popular. They draped beautifully and created a delicate, romantic look. However, these fabrics ignited at the slightest spark, turning a woman into a living torch. Ballrooms lit by hundreds of candles were especially dangerous. One careless movement, one turn too close to a candelabra, and a lush skirt would instantly be engulfed in flames. Tragedies at balls were not uncommon. Fabric manufacturers, in their pursuit of profit, did not care about safety. There were ways to make fabrics fireproof, but this made production more expensive. Therefore, materials that posed a deadly threat continued to enter the market. Women knew about this danger, but the pressure of fashion was stronger than fear. To refuse a beautiful tulle dress meant to be considered unfashionable and old-fashioned. Beauty and status required taking risks. This problem did not only affect aristocratic women. Ordinary women, workers, and maids also wore clothes made of cheap and flammable cotton fabrics. They were constantly near kitchen stoves and fireplaces, which made them particularly vulnerable. Newspapers of the time were full of stories about accidents involving clothing catching fire. One article described how two ballerinas died on stage when their tutus caught fire from the stage lights. But even such tragedies could not change fashion. This constant threat was part of everyday life for Victorian women. They lived with the knowledge that their clothing could cause their death at any moment. Why do you think society turned a blind eye to this obvious danger for so long? In the next chapter, we will talk about beauty that poisoned from within. The ideal of beauty in the Victorian era was aristocratic pallor. A tan was considered a sign of the lower class, the lot of those who worked in the fields under the scorching sun. A true lady was supposed to have flawless, white, almost porcelain skin. To achieve this effect, women used a huge amount of cosmetics. The basis of makeup was powder and white lead, which were supposed to hide any imperfections and give the face a fashionable pallor. The most popular product for this was lead white, or cerussite. This product had been known since ancient times and provided a thick, durable, pearl white coverage. Women applied it in a thick layer not only to their faces, but also to their necks, shoulders, and hands. They believed that it was not only beautiful, but also beneficial for the skin. In fact, lead white was a slow poison. Lead, a heavy metal, was gradually absorbed through the skin into the body. It accumulated in tissues and bones, causing chronic poisoning. The symptoms of lead poisoning were varied and developed slowly. Women suffered from headaches, loss of appetite, insomnia, and stomach pains. But the worst thing was that lead destroyed the nervous system. Prolonged use of such cosmetics led to irreversible consequences. It caused hair loss, darkening of tooth enamel, and damage to internal organs. The skin, which they so desperately sought to improve, eventually became gray and lifeless. Paradoxically, to hide these consequences, women applied even more whitewash. They fell into a vicious circle where the very means of beauty disfigured them. They became addicted to toxic cosmetics. Thus, the desire to conform to an imposed standard of beauty literally poisoned women. They paid with their health for the right to be considered beautiful in the eyes of society. This was yet another example of how fashion became an instrument of control and oppression. Want to know a secret that literally blinded with its beauty? Victorian beauties had another dangerous tool in their arsenal, this time to make their eyes more expressive. To achieve the fashionable, languid, and mysterious look with dilated pupils, women used drops based on belladonna extract. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, is a poisonous plant containing atropine. This substance can block nerve impulses and relax muscles. When instilled into the eyes, atropine causes the pupils to dilate significantly, making the eyes appear deeper and darker. The effect was striking, and women eagerly resorted to this trick before balls and parties. It was believed that large, shining pupils made the face more attractive and youthful. It was an easy way to stand out and attract attention. However, there was a downside to this beauty. Dilated pupils stopped responding to light. This led to photophobia and made vision blurry and vague. A woman who used belladonna drops saw the world around her as if through a fog. She could not read or do needlework. Simple tasks that required sharp vision became impossible for her. Prolonged and regular use of belladonna could lead to more serious consequences. It increased intraocular pressure, which could trigger the development of glaucoma. Ultimately, the pursuit of beautiful eyes could lead to complete loss of vision. In addition, some of the atropine inevitably entered the bloodstream through the mucous membrane of the eyes. This could cause systemic side effects characteristic of belladonna poisoning. These included dry mouth, rapid heartbeat, and even hallucinations. A gaze clouded by belladonna became a symbol of a woman's lot in life, to see the world blurred through the prism of imposed standards. Do you think modern people are willing to take such risks to keep up with beauty trends? In the next chapter, we will learn how fashion taught women to walk again, but very poorly. At the end of the Victorian era and the beginning of the Edwardian era, a new, equally uncomfortable silhouette replaced the lush crinolines. Fashion demanded that women wear narrow, straight skirts, which radically changed their gait and lifestyle. The pinnacle of this trend was the so-called hobble skirt. This skirt was so narrow around the ankles that a woman could barely move in it. She was forced to take small, short steps, which made her gait clumsy and awkward. Hence the name, a skirt that makes you hobble. It was impossible to take a step wider than the skirt allowed. This led to comical and dangerous situations. Women could not quickly cross the street climb stairs, or get on a tram without assistance. Sometimes, to prevent the narrow fabric from tearing, the hem of the skirt was additionally tightened with a special ribbon or strap. This further restricted freedom of movement. Women were literally shackled by their own clothing. The designers who created this fashion did not think about comfort. Their goal was to create a new, elongated and slender silhouette. A woman in such a skirt resembled an elegant statuette and incapable of active life. The limping skirt became a symbol of idleness. It showed that its owner led such a luxurious lifestyle that she did not need to rush anywhere or walk quickly. It was a fashion for women who were accompanied everywhere and driven around in carriages. The press immediately responded to the new trend with a wave of caricatures. Artists depicted women falling on flat ground, unable to escape danger. The skirt became a symbol of female stupidity and blind adherence to fashion. The lame skirt was the final chord in an era of extremely uncomfortable and impractical women's fashion. The coming social changes and World War I would forever change women's clothing, making it more functional. But this short period remained in history as an example of fashion absurdity. The Victorian era was obsessed with rituals associated with death. The rules of mourning were particularly strict, primarily affecting women, namely widows. A widow had to demonstrate her grief not only through her behavior, but also through her clothing, and for a very long time. The central element of mourning attire was a long, thick veil made of black crepe. This fabric had a special, stiff, and rough texture. The veil completely covered the face and fell almost to the waist, isolating the woman from the outside world. This crepe was made using special dyes and finishes that made it resistant to fading and moisture. However, these chemicals were very aggressive. Constant contact with such fabric caused skin irritation and dermatitis. But the main problem was the dust that separated from the fabric. Tiny particles of black dye and chemicals entered the respiratory tract with every breath. This led to chronic coughing, bronchitis, and other respiratory diseases. Prolonged wearing of mourning crepe could cause serious vision problems. The dense black mesh in front of the eyes forced them to strain constantly. In addition, the dye could flake off and get on the mucous membrane, causing conjunctivitis. The entire mourning outfit was very heavy and cumbersome. The dresses were made of thick black wool, and the veil and other accessories added weight. This created additional physical strain on women who were already weakened by grief. Thus, mourning fashion was yet another tool for oppressing women. It locked them into a framework of grief, damaging their physical and psychological health. It was a way to exclude widows from active social life, making them invisible under a veil of crepe. The phrase "mad as a hatter" did not come out of nowhere. It is directly related to a dangerous manufacturing process that was widespread in the Victorian era. Mercury was used to make popular felt hats, which had a devastating effect on the nervous system of workers. The process of felting wool or fur was complex and labor-intensive. To make the fibers more pliable, they were treated with mercury nitrate. Workers, known as hat makers, were exposed to this toxic substance all day long without any means of protection. Mercury vapors and its salts penetrated the body through the skin and respiratory tract. Chronic mercury poisoning led to the so-called Mad Hatter's disease. Its symptoms were terrible, from tremors and muscle weakness to serious mental disorders. Workers exhibited increased irritability, shyness, depression, and paranoia. Their speech became slurred and their gait unsteady. Ultimately, this led to complete personality breakdown and dementia. Although this problem mainly affected male workers, it is also directly relevant to women's fashion. Women were the main consumers of elegant felt hats. They wore on their heads products created at the expense of other people's health and sanity. Particles of mercury could remain in the finished product. Of course, the concentration was not high enough to cause acute poisoning in the owner of the hat. However, it still posed an unnecessary health risk. Thus, the story of the Mad Hatter is not just a funny fact associated with Lewis Carroll's character. It is a grim reminder of the price paid for Victorian elegance. It is a story of fashion built on suffering. Last on our list, but not least in importance, is the very essence of Victorian fashion. Its desire to completely reshape and distort the natural contours of the female body. Corsets, crinolines, and bustles were used to create a completely artificial silhouette that had nothing to do with real anatomy. In the second half of the century, the so-called Greek curve became particularly popular. This EUNS-shaped silhouette was achieved with a special type of corset. It pushed the bust forward and the hips backward, creating an exaggerated curve in the waist. This posture was considered the height of elegance and grace. To enhance the effect from behind, a special structure called a bustle was worn under the dress. It was a cushion or frame that created volume on the hips, making the curve of the back even more dramatic. The size of bustles varied depending on fashion, sometimes reaching grotesque proportions. The posture that women were forced to adopt was extremely unnatural and harmful to the spine. Constant tension in the lower back led to chronic back pain. The weight of the voluminous skirts concentrated on the bustle only exacerbated this problem. Walking with a Greek bend was an art in itself. Women had to maintain this unnatural posture, moving smoothly and gracefully. Any awkward movement could upset the delicate balance of the entire structure. This silhouette clearly demonstrated how much fashion could dominate the body. The female body was not perceived as something valuable in itself. It was merely the material from which the fashionable ideal had to be sculpted. Ultimately, Victorian fashion was a disaster for women. It restricted them physically, harmed their health, and forced them into the role of passive decoration. It was a fashion that did not love women, but only used them to demonstrate the status and wealth of men. We have looked at 10 of the most striking examples of how Victorian fashion crippled and restricted women. Behind every puffy dress, thin waist, and pale face was a story of discomfort, risk, and submission to cruel social norms. It was an era when beauty required not just sacrifice, but a complete surrender of one's freedom and health. These stories are not just amusing facts from the past. They are an important reminder of how clothing and beauty standards can be used as tools of social control. Victorian women were bound as tightly in corsets and crinolines as they were in the confines of propriety and patriarchal foundations. Studying these fashion disasters allows us to better understand not only the history of costume, but also the history of women's struggle for their rights. The rejection of the corset in the early 20th century was not just a fashion revolution, but a symbol of liberation. Women were finally able to breathe freely, both literally and figuratively. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. We are very interested to know what other secrets of history you would like to uncover with us. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.